In the heart of North Africa sits the Libyan Desert. It's a merciless sea of sand where daytime temperatures can hit 120 degrees and at night, almost below freezing. It was 1943 when a US bomber crew had to parachute from their dying airplane. They became stranded here with no map, no food, and almost no water. What followed was a desperate attempt to survive for days in one of the harshest places on Earth. This is the story of the Lady Be Good crew. It was April 4th, 1943, when the Lady Be Good left Sullock Airfield for its first mission, a night raid on Naples. The aircraft was a B-24 Liberator, which is a long-range heavy bomber. At the controls is Lieutenant William Hatton, young but steady. Beside him sits his co-pilot, Robert Toner, the kind of officer who keeps a diary even on combat runs. In the bomb bay was John Warvka, the bombardier who was eager but green. For the 9 men aboard, this run was supposed to be routine. Drop the bombs, turn home, and land before dawn. The raid itself ends up going smoothly. They encounter no enemy fighters and no anti-air artillery. But on the return, things would begin to unravel. In the desert below them, blowing sand creates a haze that swallows the horizon and begins to blur the coastline along the Mediterranean into nothing. A compass and a radio direction finder, these tools would help them guide them home in the dark. But it crackled with static and the bearings began to shift back and forth, never settling on one course. From the cockpit, Hatton and Toner believe they're still over the Mediterranean, hunting for the dark outline of North Africa beneath them. But in truth, they had actually already crossed the coast hours earlier, flying straight past Solich Airport without ever seeing it. But back at radio control, they catch fragments of the pilot's calls just after midnight. Controllers can hear them asking for bearings, but none of the signals line up. The reciprocal readings between the tower and the plane just don't match. No one can really tell for sure where this plane is. Unfortunately, that broken radio chatter is the last contact anyone will ever have with the Lady Be Good. But back on board the plane, it's nearly 2 a.m. And unfortunately, the fuel gauges are sinking fast. And one by one, the engines begin to stutter and die. Beneath the plane is the desert. It's nothing more than a black void, and unfortunately, Hatton is convinced that what he's looking at is actually the ocean. Rather than risk a crash landing into the sea, he makes the call that they have to jump. Each man straps on his parachute, grabbing what he can, canteens, pistols, and emergency kits, barely enough to keep someone alive for more than a day, and one by one, they step off the plane into the dark. Unfortunately, Warvka never makes it. His chute didn't open on the fall. The others slowly drift down into silence, surprisingly scattered across the dunes, unaware that their bomber, with its engine sputtering out, will glide without them and land intact only 16 miles away. When the sun ends up coming up, the 8 men gather together in the sand, believing that they must be close to the sea. But in reality, they were hundreds of miles inland and very ill prepared to stay alive in the desert. It doesn't take long for the men to start feeling the conditions of the desert as the heat begins radiating off the dunes like a furnace. The men immediately take stock of what little they managed to carry from the plane. One single pistol, a handful of flares, the parachutes they drifted down on, and between them, only 1.5 canteens of water, barely a mouthful for each man. With no food, no real shelter, and no way to contact anyone, they knew that this kit was the only thing that could keep them alive. But unfortunately, there just wasn't enough to do it for long, and they knew that. This is when co-pilot Robert Toner begins to track their struggles in his small diary. His first line was blunt: plane down, Warvka missing. He would continue to keep notes, short, restrained, and almost clinical, but they would become ingrained in history. As the first night passed, the men were freezing and shivering in their uniforms. But eventually, as the sun rose, they felt a little reprieve in the moderate temperatures somewhere between day and night. This is when they have to face their first decision: to stay put or try and move. Staying put, on paper, might have made sense, because they had no working radio and no way to really determine their position. They could simply stay where they were and wait for a search and rescue aircraft to fly overhead and signal it with the flares. But in the minds of the crew, they knew that the coastline couldn't be far. They believed that they had parachuted out over the Mediterranean and simply drifted inland. If they could march north, surely they would strike the coast, hitting a road or even one of the patrols. They all felt that sitting still in the desert would be like a slow death. So the plan was set. They would march north towards what they believed was the sea. To survive the heat, they would move at night when the sand was cool enough to walk without burning through their boots. During the day, they would rest beneath the makeshift shelters made from the parachutes. So this choice to walk north was a critical decision, because what they couldn't have known was that their plane was only 16 miles south of them. And in that plane, they would have found supplies to survive. However, in all reality, it would have been like finding a needle in a haystack. And not to mention, probably the only way they actually would have found it is if the plane had caught fire upon impact, sending up a smoke column, which may have signaled help, but also would have let the men find the plane. Maybe, just maybe in a stroke of luck, they could have found some survival supplies in that fire. But luck just wasn't on their side. Furthermore, if they had walked south, they eventually would have come across areas that had oases with fresh water, and it would have been near British patrol routes in the desert, eventually leading them to rescue. But now that they had a plan to walk north, they would need a way to navigate. By the day, they could see nothing but waves of dunes, so they fixed their course by the stars at night. One of their compasses guided the line of the march, always pointing north. Each man carried what they could, but with the heat and the painstaking walk in the deep sand, the amount of gear they could carry slowly became stripped down. It didn't take long in those temperatures before the boots tore and the men's feet had blisters. They would have to wrap their feet in parachute cloth just to be able to move. The men would begin to leave markers, just in case a plane flew overhead, including parachute fabric that was laid out in arrows indicating their direction. The men certainly had no illusions about the situation that we're in. They know at most they could survive a couple days. And this survival was really stripped to its bones because they had nothing to really make do with. It's not like there's food out there for them or water, so all they had was to march north and ration the few sips of water they had here and there. This plan was going to take a lot of discipline and faith, but unfortunately it was built on one terrible mistake. Instead of closing in on the Mediterranean, they were already hundreds of miles past it, and every step north actually carried them farther from rescue and farther from any chance of survival. And the men would push this march for days, each day repeating the same brutal cycle. Collapse at dawn under thin strips of shade, with their lips swelling, skin cracking, and their bodies growing weaker. At nightfall, resuming their march, step after step, always further into the desert. Well, I don't know what's worse, being lost in the desert or endlessly scrolling YouTube to find something that you actually like. And hopefully, this video is it. And if so, consider subscribing to the channel or sharing it with somebody you know. While the men crawl across the Sahara, a search for them is already underway. At Salak, commanders assumed that the Lady Be Good had ditched at sea. Immediately, aircraft were sent to sweep the Mediterranean, dropping flares and scanning empty waves looking for rafts or signs of wreckage. But unfortunately, nothing is ever found. Every mile flown over the water was a mile wasted. After several fruitless days, the search is called off. However, the conclusion was simple. The bomber and her crew must have gone down in the deep, swallowed whole. I couldn't imagine what would happen to these poor men if they actually realized their situation. And I don't know if it would have been for better or for worse. But unfortunately, they would keep stumbling through the desert, constantly scanning the sky, waiting for the rescue they were all certain would come. Surely, there had to be planes searching for them. If they had known the truth, I think they might have stopped marching altogether. Given where they were, it probably didn't make a difference. And by this time, a few days in, their strength is starting to dwindle. And by the fourth day, they realized that survival was slipping out of their hands, because even walking was becoming almost impossible. Their feet were shredded from blisters and heat, and they were so dehydrated, their muscles were constantly cramping. During the reprieve of night, Robert Toner would take time to write in his diary. And it seemed that his journal was the only steady thing in this chaos. At first, his lines would talk about the soldiers' conditions, making clinical remarks like cold night, sandstorm. But by the fourth day, his words were actually shrinking into fragments. Simple statements like, no help yet. The pencil marks drug across the page as if the pencil itself was weighing him down. The group is no longer holding it together because some start to collapse every few steps and others are too weak to carry them. And this is when a decision is made. It's made with no argument, no drama, just pure exhaustion. The three strongest of the men, Shelley, Ripslinger, and Moore, would push on. They promised the other men they would find water and rescue, or both. Now they become the only lifeline to the rest of the group. 5 men remain behind. Huddled beneath the parachute, the split of the group changes everything. The 3 men, Shelley, Ripsling, and Moore, slowly fade over the horizon, their figures shrinking until the desert swallows them. The remaining 5 crawl beneath the only shelter they had, their parachute. They were just too weak to crawl at this point, and the only thing they could do is sit and wait for the other men to return with help. Toner kept writing during this time. His diary is the thread that ties the days together. On the 5th day, he writes, "Very weak, eyes bad." It's almost eerie how clinical his entries are. Another entry simply says, "No water." Each line becomes shorter than last. It's like the writing itself is telling a story of his decline. For the 5 left behind, all they could do was huddle together and simply wait. For the 3 men that set out in search of help, the walk was literal hell. Like I mentioned earlier, their feet were torn open, and at this point, every ounce of clothing they're wearing becomes too heavy, and they start stripping off their shirts and throwing off all of their gear, piece by piece, anything to desperately lighten the march. Every step for them becomes a gamble because they're so dangerously dehydrated. But somehow still, they keep going, convinced that eventually they will find water, a road, or the sea itself just beyond the next dune. Unfortunately, that desperate march through the desert would come to an end in just a matter of days. But unbelievably, one of the men actually made it over 100 miles before collapsing into the sand, his footprint stretching farther than anyone believed a man could walk without water. All 3 men unfortunately perished before ever finding help. For the 5 who remained behind, they had to endure their own agony. And by the 7th day, the last marks in the journal are recorded. This is assumed to be the moment that the rest of the men perished. All of the men of the Lady Be Good are assumed to be dead by the 8th day. For these guys, they fought harder than I can imagine, way beyond what anyone thought the human body could endure. They literally survived for 8 days with barely any water in the Sahara Desert, through nothing but willpower and desperation. By all medical accounts, these guys should have died within the first few days. The human body in normal conditions can only go about 3 days without water, and certainly much less than that in the desert and when you're walking. I don't know what would have been going through their heads in the last moments because we see the journal end abruptly, but from how hard these guys pushed, I think even up to the last breath of the last person, there was hope that they would actually be rescued. And with the Lady Be Good assumed to be at the bottom of the Mediterranean, nobody really ever searched the desert, and their story would go cold for over 16 years. When in 1959, a team of oil surveyors flying low over the Libyan desert spotted something out of place. It was the outline of a bomber resting in the sand, nearly intact, and it didn't take them long to realize it was the Lady Be Good. When investigators got to the scene, it was said to be eerie, that somehow the radios actually still powered on. That some of the emergency supplies sat in the plane untouched. There was even a thermos of coffee. The bomber had somehow glided safely onto the desert floor with everything the men would have needed to survive, if only they had stayed in the plane. But as they looked around, they realized that the crew was nowhere to be found. That absence, though, sparked a second search, one that fanned north into the dunes, and soon investigators began finding the first traces. Parts of a parachute here, a fragment of gear there. Farther on, they start to find skeletal remains lying in the sand, and the line continued mile after mile, stretching towards the horizon. Among the bodies were things like watches, pistols, fragments of uniforms, and Robert Toner's diary. Its clipped entries telling the story of their march, the last moments of their desperate struggle to survive. His words gave a voice to what the desert had silenced: the sandstorms, the thirst, and the desperate hope of rescue. Piece by piece, the path of this crew was reconstructed. 8 men had marched in a straight line north, believing salvation lay just days away, when in fact, they were heading further and further from rescue, hundreds of miles into the desert. All were eventually accounted for except for Lieutenant Moore, whose body was never conclusively recovered. I can't believe the ordeal that these guys went through. It absolutely boggles my mind, not only how far they made it, but how a perfect storm of kind of misunderstandings about their location and which direction to head led them literally into the path of death. This is definitely one of the cases, if they turn left versus right, they may have lived. It's really hard to say, but unfortunately, luck just wasn't on their side. I hope wherever they are, they're resting in peace. That is definitely a heartbreaking story, and I just want to say thanks for joining me in this one, and I'll be back again next week with another crazy story. See you then.